The storm had raged for days, but now Blackwood Valley stood in eerie silence. The wind was gone, leaving only the cold, biting air. Ronald Ross stood at his kitchen window, his eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. And then he saw it, Rex, his retired K9 trotting back from the woods. But something was different. The dog wasn't wagging his tail. He was tense-focused. In his mouth, Rex carried a black stone larger than any the dog had brought before. Ronald frowned, his heart pounding. Rex wasn't playing. He was warning him. But what was out there, and what did the stone have to do with a secret that had been buried for decades? Ronald watched as Rex slowly climbed the porch steps, his old joints creaking with each deliberate step. The dog moved with a purpose, his eyes still locked on the stone in his mouth. It wasn't the playful trot of a pet. This was the gait of a soldier alert and ready. When Rex dropped the rock at Ronald's feet, it made a dull, heavy sound, not the playful clink of a stone, but the thud of something ominous. Ronald knelt down to pick it up, but as his fingers brushed the surface, a chill ran through him. The rock was too heavy and its texture off. It was slick in some places, rough in others, as if it had been forged, not formed naturally. The smell hit him, neck sulfur, burning something that shouldn't have been in these woods. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a strange rock. Rex wasn't playing. This was a warning. Ronald's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the dog whose amber eyes never left the stone. And that's when it hit him. Rex had found something buried on Blackwood Ridge. But what he wasn't ready for, what he would discover next. Ronald Ross had never been one for company. Life after the Corps had become a quiet shuffle of routines. The ache in his knee, a reminder of his past, throbbed in time with the slow rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. The stillness of Blackwood Valley was always a balm for his soul, though even this remote place had its way of forcing old wounds to the surface. It wasn't the land or the trees or the mountain peaks that bothered him, it was the memories. He sat at his kitchen window, his back hunched slightly, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that was losing heat faster than it should have. The world outside was gray and wet, the landscape muted by the storm that had swept through for the last 3 days. Now there was only silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes. The snow had stopped falling, and the ground lay blanketed in a thick carpet of damp leaves, their color fading in the morning light. Everything about the valley was frozen in place, suspended. Ronald watched it all, his eyes scanning the woods that bordered his property. It wasn't the landscape that held his attention, though. It was Rex. His old German shepherd had disappeared into the trees again that morning, a regular occurrence in recent days. But today there was something different. The dog had always been sharp, his senses honed to an extraordinary degree after years of service. He had been more than a companion. He had been a partner in the truest sense of the word. Rex had served as a bomb dog trained to detect IEDs and explosives in foreign deserts, far from this quiet place. Together they had survived. But even after the war, even after the years of hard service, Rex still had a purpose. And that purpose had led him into the woods again this morning. Ronald hadn't thought much of it at first. The dog was getting older, and perhaps it was just the way dogs were. They wandered, sniffed things, found things. But every time Rex came back, the rocks, the strange black rocks, were bigger, heavier, and the look in Rex's eyes had changed. His eyes were always alert, yes, but recently they had been filled with something more urgency. Ronald took a slow sip from his mug, the bitter taste lingering on his tongue. The heat seeped into his cold hands, but it didn't bring warmth to the tight knot in his chest. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the fact that Rex had been acting strangely, or that he, Ronald, had been trying so hard to ignore it. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for Rex to return. Sure enough, the dog appeared through the mist at the edge of the forest. But today was different. He wasn't trotting back with a casual gait, his tail wagging as it normally would. No, Rex moved with purpose, each step deliberate, his body tense. His head was low, his ears forward, and his eyes were fixed ahead, not at Ronald, but at the space beyond. Ronald's chest tightened. Something was wrong. He set his mug down on the counter and moved to the back door. The cold air hit him as he opened it, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the cabin. It was a biting wind carrying with it the promise of more snow, and yet the air felt heavy-weighted with an unsettling energy. "Come on in, buddy," Ronald called, his voice hoarse with the dryness of a man who rarely spoke aloud anymore. "It's freezing out there." But Rex didn't respond to the call. The dog didn't bound up the porch steps like usual. Instead, he walked slowly, his movements deliberate, each step heavy. Ronald stepped back to allow him in, but Rex didn't push past him. The dog paused at the threshold, his amber eyes locked onto Ronald with a look that could only be described as serious. The kind of gaze that Ronald had seen in the field when Rex had a target in sight, when something dangerous was near. "Rex," Ronald said softly, a knot forming in his throat. The The dog didn't move, his focus unwavering. It was as though Rex was waiting for him to do something. And then Rex dropped the stone. It landed with a dull thud heavier than any rock Ronald had ever seen. The noise echoed in the stillness of the cabin, a sound that immediately set Ronald's heart racing. The stone didn't bounce. It didn't roll. It simply fell heavy and solid. The kind of sound you might hear when something ancient and ominous is being placed before you. Ronald bent down to pick it up, his knee protesting the movement. He braced himself on the doorframe and reached for the stone. It was rough to the touch, jagged in places and strangely slick in others, as though it had been burned or melted at some point. His fingers grazed over its surface, and that's when the smell hit him, faint at first, but unmistakable. Sulfur. It was the unmistakable scent of something that had burned hot, far too hot. The kind of smell that lingered in the air after an explosion, a blast that left its mark on everything in its wake. But this wasn't some military-grade weapon. This was a stone in his kitchen. The smell lingered in the air, sharp and acrid enough to make his stomach tighten. Ronald pulled the stone closer, inspecting it more closely. It was heavy, far too heavy for what it looked like. The surface was rough, with patches that seemed to glow faintly smooth like glass. His fingers rubbed over it, trying to clean away the dirt and grime that clung to its surface. But what really unsettled him was the weight. It was like a rock made of something else, entirely, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something dangerous. Rex sat beside him, unmoving eyes locked on the stone, his gaze sharp and focused. He didn't look like a dog looking for attention or affection. No, Rex looked like a dog on a mission. He looked like a soldier waiting for his handler to act. Ronald froze. He recognized the stance, the passive alert. It was a behavior that any military dog trained to detect explosives would exhibit. When a dog detected a bomb, an IED, or any other dangerous substance, it would sit down and stare at it, keeping perfectly still. The handler had to step in, make the decision, take control of the situation. That was what Rex was doing now, alerting him, waiting for Ronald to make the call. But there was no bomb in Blackwood Valley. No explosives in the mountains. None that Ronald knew of, anyway. Still, Rex wasn't wrong. Ronald stood up slowly, staring at the stone in his hand. His heart was beating faster now, and it wasn't just from the cold. He could feel the tension building in his chest, rising like a slow tide. The dog was never wrong. Not when it came to this. Rex, Ronald muttered, his voice shaking. He wasn't sure what to do. It's just a rock. But Rex didn't move. He stayed in position, his eyes never leaving the stone. The dog let out a low, frustrated sound, a soft growl that vibrated in his chest. It wasn't a warning bark. It wasn't a sign of aggression. It was the sound of a dog correcting his handler, a soldier telling his commander to stop ignoring the obvious. Ronald's grip tightened around the stone. The smell of sulfur still clung to the air. He rubbed his thumb over the rough patches of the stone. "This is serious, isn't it?" Ronald whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Rex didn't answer, but his eyes, those amber pools, never left the stone. Ronald's breath caught in his throat. If Rex was right, and he always was, then whatever was buried up there in the woods on Blackwood Ridge was far from ordinary. It wasn't just a forgotten relic. It wasn't just some weathered stone that had somehow gotten loose during the storm. It was something dangerous, something buried and waiting. Something that had been unearthed by the landslide. But what could it be? Ronald stood there, looking at the stone, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to acknowledge that his past, the war, the secrets, the things he had buried deep inside was knocking on his door again. But Rex had found something. The dog had sensed it, and it was too late to turn back now. He couldn't ignore it. Not with Rex staring at him like that, waiting for him to make the right decision. "Okay," Ronald said softly, as if speaking to himself. He could feel the weight of the old Marine's training settling over him once again. Duty, honor, responsibility. We're going back, aren't we? Rex didn't bark or wag his tail. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, ever the silent partner. Ronald stood in the kitchen, his hands still wrapped around the strange black stone that Rex had brought in. The dog was now sitting at attention, his amber eyes locked on the rock with an intensity that made Ronald uneasy. The sulphurous smell still lingered in the air, sharp and bitter like a warning. It wasn't just a rock. Ronald could feel it. Deep in his bones, he could sense that this was something far more dangerous than a simple piece of nature's debris. Rex didn't act like this unless there was something to find: a bomb, an IED, a hidden threat. But there were no bombs in Montana. The mountains were quiet, far from the battles and the chaos of the world Ronald had left behind when he retired from the Corps. There were no enemies here, no enemies left to fight. But Rex was telling him otherwise. "Rex," Ronald muttered, kneeling down and gently placing the stone back on the counter. The dog didn't move his posture, unyielding as though the rock itself was his mission, his reason for being here. His amber eyes flicked to Ronald for just a moment before returning to the stone. There was no confusion in those eyes. Rex knew exactly what he had found, and that scared Ronald more than he wanted to admit. It had been 6 days now. 6 days of Rex disappearing into the forest every morning each time, returning with a similar stone, each time bringing it to Ronald with the same unwavering focus. But this stone was different, larger, heavier. And the way Rex had carried it back, the way the dog moved with a purpose, this wasn't just the old K9 doing his usual morning rounds. Ronald felt a shift inside himself, a stirring of something he had pushed down for years. The years of military training, the years of being in command, of being responsible for the safety of others, all the way down to the smallest detail. He could no longer ignore the growing sense of urgency that Rex had instilled in him. "I'm going with you," Ronald said, his voice almost hoarse. The words hung in the air, a quiet promise he wasn't sure he could keep. But Rex didn't need his words. The dog had already made up his mind. He stood up, tail, stiff ears, forward his body, a taut line of readiness. Rex had been trained to follow orders, but when it came to something important, the dog would follow instinct, and Ronald had learned to trust that instinct. Ronald grabbed his old leather jacket from the hook by the door, the worn fabric stiff against his fingers. It was the jacket he had worn during his service, the one that had seen countless nights of bitter cold, of desperate battles fought on unfamiliar soil. It had been with him through the worst of it, and somehow it had survived the years just like he had. He slipped it on over his plaid flannel shirt and adjusted the collar as the weight of the moment settled over him. "Wait here, Rex," Ronald said, though he knew it was pointless. The dog didn't need an order. Rex had already made up his mind to lead the way. He grabbed his boots, laced them tight, and took one last glance at the cabin. It was a simple place tucked away in the valley where he could forget the world, where the ghosts of the past were distant echoes and the land was quiet enough to hear his thoughts. But that silence, that peace, was being disrupted. And it wasn't just by the dog. The stone, the smell. Something was buried out there. Something had been unearthed, and Rex had found it. Ronald's breath caught in his throat as he closed the door behind him, stepping into the cold morning air. The snow from the storm still clung to the ground, thick and wet, the trees weighed down with frozen moisture. The path that led toward Blackwood Ridge was barely visible under the carpet of leaves and mud left by the storm. The valley was shrouded in a damp, eerie quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the trees swaying under the wind's force. Rex moved ahead, nose to the ground, tracking something Ronald couldn't see, but he trusted the dog's instincts. He always had. The old K9 was still strong, still focused, despite his stiff joints and fading hearing. There was no slowing down today. The dog was on a mission, and Ronald was right there beside him. The path had changed since the storm. The landscape was no longer the familiar one Ronald had hiked many times before. The trail had been destroyed by fallen trees, limbs broken by the wind, and the heavy mud had made the path treacherous. It wasn't the kind of terrain Ronald was used to. But that didn't matter now. They moved forward step by step, Rex leading the way. The air was thick with moisture, and the cold began to seep through Ronald's clothes as they ascended the ridge. The higher they climbed, the more difficult it became to find solid footing. His knee was protesting the old injury, flaring with each step, but he pushed through it. There was no turning back now. Rex led him into the dense thicket, the trees twisting and bending in the wake of the storm's fury. The forest was a maze of limbs and broken branches, and Ronald had to push them aside to continue. Every step felt heavier. His bad leg ached, but his mind was sharp, focused on one thing, finding out what Rex had discovered. They reached a section where the ground gave way to a steep incline. The trail had completely disappeared beneath a tangle of branches, boulders, and debris. The storm had left the forest in chaos, but Rex didn't falter. The dog stopped at the edge of the debris field, his eyes scanning the area, his tail stiff. There was something out there. Ronald approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick, and the smell of earth and wet leaves hung heavily in the air. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the broken branches, he noticed something odd. There was a place in the ground, a dark patch, where the soil looked different. It was disturbed, as if something had recently been dug up uncovered. Rex stood motionless, his gaze locked on the spot. The dog's posture had changed. This was no longer a search for a bomb. It was something more. Rex wasn't searching for danger. He was waiting for something to reveal itself. Ronald crouched down, his breath fogging in the cold air. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly, and began to clear away the dirt and debris. As he did, the faint outline of something hard emerged from the earth. It was a piece of metal blackened and scorched by fire. Ronald's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a buried rock. It wasn't just debris left by the storm. He dug deeper, his hands shaking with the realization. The soil was hard compacted by the weight of the years, but there was something beneath it, something that didn't belong here. With each scrape of his hand, the shape became clearer. It was a foundation, a structure of stone and metal half buried in the earth. Something had been hidden here, buried long ago, waiting for a storm to uncover it, and Rex had found it. As Ronald cleared the last of the debris away, he gasped. There, half buried in the soil, was what looked like the remnants of a cabin foundation, charred and cracked by fire. The stone was blackened, the edges chipped away by time and the force of the storm. The smell of sulfur hung in the air like a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Ronald stood up slowly, his heart racing. This wasn't just a piece of the past. This was a secret, and that's when he saw it. Tucked in the corner, partially buried under the remains of the foundation, was something that made his blood run cold. A human bone. Rex was still, his amber eyes fixed on the object as though guarding it. Ronald's chest tightened, and his breath caught in his throat. He reached down carefully, moving the rubble aside. What he uncovered next was a metal box, rusted and burned, but still intact. His fingers brushed against it, cold and stiff with the weight of history. It was an ammunition crate, and when he opened it, he found the answer to the mystery. Sapphires. Massive raw sapphires fused together by fire, twisted and melted their colors, gleaming faintly in the fading light. They were caught between the bones of a man who had died here trying to protect them. Ronald's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a relic of the past. This was the remains of a man who had died protecting something. A treasure, a legacy, a secret buried for decades waiting to be found. The wind howled as it cut through the trees, shaking their skeletal branches in an eerie dance. Blackwood Ridge had always been an unpredictable place, even in the calmest of seasons, but now the storm had left its mark and the landscape was a war zone. Fallen trees, washed-out trails, and the lingering smell of wet earth all added to the sense of disarray. The ground was slick with mud, and every step Ronald took felt like a battle with nature itself. He wasn't sure what had drawn him back here to this spot where Rex had led him to a half-buried foundation, the remnants of something long forgotten. It was as if the mountain itself was calling him, as if the secrets hidden here were no longer content with staying buried. But that wasn't the only thing that had pushed him forward. It was the dog. Rex's instincts, honed by years of service, had found something, and Ronald couldn't shake the feeling that it was a thread he had to follow. He couldn't walk away from it. The metal box, half buried in the earth, was old, its rusted edges and warped surface telling a story of decay, of fire, of something destroyed long ago. And yet the contents, the sapphires, Ronald had never seen anything like them. Raw, unpolished stones, their color a deep, brilliant blue, the kind of color that spoke of untold wealth. But that wasn't the strangest part. No, the strangest part was the way they were fused with the metal, the glass, the bone. They weren't just gemstones. They were a grim reminder of a life lost and a legacy left behind. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just holding a relic, he was holding a piece of history. A history that had been buried, forgotten until now. As Ronald stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he touched the cold metal crate, he could hear the faint sound of Rex's heavy breathing behind him. The dog didn't move. He didn't bark or growl. He simply stood, his body still waiting. Ronald glanced down at the dog. There was something else in Rex's eyes now. It wasn't just the sharpness of the old K9 who had served in war zones. It was something more, something deeper. There was a sense of recognition in the dog's gaze, as if Rex knew exactly what had been unearthed, what had been lost here. Ronald stood up slowly, the weight of the crate in his hands. His heart was racing. He wanted to move, to leave this place, but he couldn't. Not yet. Something wasn't right. The silence of the forest around them felt heavy, oppressive. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make the next move. He looked around, his eyes scanning the wreckage of the landslide. It was clear the storm had unearthed more than just the foundation and the metal crate. The earth was torn open, as if something had been disturbed that wasn't meant to be touched. The path that had once been familiar to Ronald was now a maze of broken trees and shattered rocks. But none of this was important now. What mattered was what lay ahead. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but Ronald wasn't ready to piece them together. He glanced back down at the box in his hands, and that's when it hit him. The feeling. The one that had been gnawing at him ever since Rex had first brought in the Blackstone. The same sense of dread, of inevitability, that had followed him home from the war. There was something buried here. Something more than just a treasure or a relic. It was a story that had been left behind, waiting to be told. And Ronald knew deep down that he couldn't walk away from it. Not now. Not with Rex by his side, not with this moment hanging in the air like a question he had no choice but to answer. "We have to go back, don't we?" Ronald whispered to Rex, though he already knew the answer. The dog's eyes met his again, and in that silent gaze, Ronald found the confirmation he needed. But just before he turned to leave, a sharp biting wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distinct scent of something familiar, something from his past. Ronald froze. The scent of sulfur, of fire, of war. It was faint but unmistakable. He looked around, his heart hammering in his chest. Something was out there, something that had been hidden beneath the earth, beneath the years, waiting for them to find it. Ronald stood motionless for a long moment. His fingers tightened around the metal crate, and he felt the weight of it not just in his hands but in his chest. The past had a way of following you home. With a slow exhale, Ronald made up his mind. He couldn't leave without answers. Not now. Not when Rex had led him here. Not when the scent of danger was so close. He reached down carefully, placing the crate into his rucksack. Rex shifted at his side, his body tense alert. It was clear that the dog wasn't just waiting for orders anymore. He was waiting for Ronald to take the next step, to make the decision that would lead them both deeper into whatever mystery had been buried on this mountain. "We're going back to the cabin, buddy," Ronald said softly, his voice more resolute now. "But we're not done yet." He turned, signaling for Rex to follow, and they began the slow trek back through the dense woods. The wind continued to howl, but Ronald barely heard it anymore. His mind was fixed on the past, on the memories that had been buried just like the foundation he had uncovered. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something was watching them, waiting. But he couldn't shake the feeling that for once it wasn't the storm he had to worry about. It was the truth. The path back to the cabin was no easier than the journey up. The forest was a different place now. The storm had reshaped it, torn apart the familiar trails and hidden dangers that Ronald had once known by heart. Every step was slower, more deliberate, as if the landscape itself was trying to hold them in place, unwilling to let them leave. Ronald's knee throbbed with every step, but he pushed through the pain. It wasn't the first time his body had protested, but this time, the weight of the crate slung across his back felt heavier, more significant. Every step carried more than just the remnants of a cabin and a box of sapphires. It carried the story of Dalton Mercer, the man whose legacy had been buried beneath the earth for decades. And it carried the truth that Ronald had been avoiding for far too long. Rex moved ahead, his body moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a dog of his age. The old K9 was still sharp, still strong, still carrying the weight of his past like a badge of honor. It was as though the dog knew the journey wasn't just for him anymore. It was for both of them. Every now and then, Ronald would glance down at the stone, still wedged in the deep pocket of his jacket. That black rock, he could still smell it, the faint scent of sulfur of something that had burned long ago. It had been on his mind since he first touched it, since Rex had dropped it at his feet. There was something about it that nagged at him, something unsettling about the way the dog had acted around it. The storm had passed, but the air still felt thick with tension. The closer they got to the cabin, the more the weight of the mystery pressed down on Ronald's chest. It was as though the past, the war, the losses, the buried secrets had never truly left him. It had just waited for the right moment to resurface. When they finally reached the cabin, Ronald didn't go inside. The sight of it, the cabin, the hearth, the old chair by the fire felt too confining now. The walls, the doors, the windows that had once seemed like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. There was something about being back here in this quiet corner of the world that made the past feel too close. Ronald stood in the yard, staring out toward Blackwood Ridge. The silhouette of the mountain loomed in the distance, dark and imposing against the bruised sky. He could feel the pull, the call to return to the ridge, to finish what had been started. But there was something else pulling at him, something that went beyond the land, beyond the treasure, beyond even the dog. It was the memories. He had been back in the cabin for only a few minutes when the flashbacks started. They always started slow, like a ripple of water moving beneath the surface. At first it was the smell, the burnt metal, the acrid scent of cordite and smoke. Then it was the sound, the distant roar of a mortar shell before it hit the deep thud of an explosion that rattled everything inside you. And then it was the faces of the men he had fought with the men who hadn't made it out. Ronald closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the memories away. But they were always there waiting to take hold. He was back in the desert again, the heat suffocating the air thick with the dust of war. He could hear the crackle of radio static, the distant murmur of his comrades. He was crouched low behind a rock, the sun beating down on him, the sweat dripping from his brow as he adjusted his rifle. The mission was clear. They had to clear the area, check for IEDs, make sure it was safe. He had always trusted Rex. The dog was an extension of him, an extension of his mind. He could feel the connection between them, the bond that had been forged through years of shared danger, shared pain. But then the explosion. It had come out of nowhere, a flash of light, a deafening roar. The ground had shifted beneath him, the world had tilted, and in that moment all he could do was protect himself, protect the men around him, and pray to God that Rex had found what needed to be found. When the smoke cleared, Ronald had been alive. And so had Rex. But many of his comrades were not. The memory passed, but it left a scar, a mark that didn't heal. It never healed. Ronald opened his eyes and looked down at Rex, who was sitting quietly by his side, staring out at the ridge. The dog didn't speak, didn't move, but there was a look in his eyes that mirrored the feeling inside Ronald's chest. The same unspoken understanding. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the present, about what Rex had found, about what they had to do. Ronald reached down, scratching the dog's ears, feeling the roughness of the fur beneath his fingers. He looked out at the ridge once more, the memories of war, of death, of sacrifice, mingling with the weight of the present. "We need to go back, don't we?" he murmured to Rex. The dog didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He simply nodded as if to say, "We don't have a choice." And so Ronald knew that they would. The ridge was calling them, and the answers were buried there. Answers that had been waiting for far too long. It was time to uncover them, to put the pieces together. And for the first time in years, it was time for Ronald to stop hiding. He turned back toward the cabin, heading for the small, worn rucksack where he kept his gear. He hadn't touched it in years, but now it was the one thing that seemed to make sense. He needed a flashlight, a first aid kit, a coil of rope, and a shovel. He didn't know what they were walking into, but he knew that whatever was hidden on Blackwood Ridge wasn't just a secret. It was a key to something far bigger than either of them understood. Ronald opened the rucksack and began packing, moving with the same purpose he had once had in the field. There was no hesitation now. There was only the mission and the call to see it through. Rex stood up and padded over to the door, sitting by it, his eyes fixed on Ronald with a quiet intensity. There was no need for words. The dog knew what had to be done. Ronald grabbed his jacket and pulled it on, feeling the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. He laced up his boots, securing them tight, and then walked over to the door. The cold mountain air hit him immediately, but it didn't deter him. The cold had always been a part of life here. "Let's go, Marine," Ronald said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. The dog gave a soft whine of approval and nudged the door open with his nose. As they stepped out into the cold, the weight of the mountain loomed ahead, but Ronald didn't hesitate. He had a partner by his side. He had a mission to complete. And for the first time in a long while, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The trek back toward Blackwood Ridge felt like a slow crawl through a memory Ronald couldn't shake. The air had grown thinner. The higher they climbed, the scent of the pines growing richer with each step. Snow had dusted the trail, turning the mountainside into a monochrome landscape of white and gray. But there was something more beneath the surface of this serene, cold beauty, something buried, hidden away like an old wound waiting to be unearthed. And as Ronald walked, he felt it deep in his bones. Rex moved ahead, his usual energy tempered by age, but still driven by a singular focus. The dog's nose was to the ground, sniffing through the snow, searching for something that only he could detect. He had been a K-9 unit for most of his life, trained to detect the presence of explosives. But this wasn't about bombs. This was something else. Ronald could feel it. Something about the way Rex moved slow but deliberate told him that they weren't just chasing shadows anymore. Ronald glanced down at the dog's heavy limp, the stiff gait caused by the arthritis that had crept up on Rex in the last few years. He had been there beside Ronald through thick and thin, through the dust of battlefields and the quieter days of retirement. Rex had seen it all. He had lost as much as Ronald had, if not more. The dog was as much a casualty of war as his handler, but neither of them spoke about it. They carried their scars in silence. They made their way to the spot where the storm had torn through the forest, where the landslide had peeled back the earth, exposing what lay beneath. The mountain was still a stillness that felt unnatural, as though it had been holding its breath ever since the disaster. The weight of the past pressed down harder with every step they took, every moment that brought them closer to the foundation they had uncovered. Ronald stopped at the edge of the ridge, his breath fogging in the cold air. His knee ached, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't here for his body, he was here for the truth. The truth about what had been buried, about the legacy of Dalton Mercer. They had already found the metal crate half buried in the wreckage of the landslide, along with the scattered remnants of a structure, a home once inhabited by a man who had vanished without a trace. But Ronald couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this than just a forgotten relic. There was more to Dalton Mercer's story, something deeper, something personal. Rex had brought him here for a reason, and Ronald wasn't about to walk away from it. He dropped to one knee, his fingers brushing the snow-covered ground as he searched for the place where the foundation was buried. The earth had been disturbed, but not enough to give up its secrets easily. It took time, effort, and patience, but eventually the familiar outline of the stone foundation became clear. The remnants of a cabin that had once stood tall here, its walls burned to ash in a fire that had come decades ago. Ronald wiped his brow, his hands aching as he dug deeper, each movement reverberating with the weight of years that had passed. The memories came back to him in waves. The storm, the fire, the confusion, the pain. He had seen it all before, but not like this. Not with the weight of the sapphires, not with the legacy of a lost soldier weighing on his chest. As he cleared more of the debris, he found it again, another metal box, this one larger than the first. This time it was nearly completely buried in the earth, its surface rusted and battered by time. But when Ronald pried it open, the sight that greeted him was more unsettling than he could have imagined. Inside was a cluster of stones, but these weren't ordinary rocks. They were sapphires, massive, rough stones that gleamed even in the dim light, as if they held some sort of unspoken power. They were fused together not just by heat but by something deeper, something that made them look more like a grotesque sculpture than a collection of gems. They had been burned, melted, and twisted together by the fire that had consumed this cabin. The heat had done more than destroy. It had fused the very essence of the stones to the metal crate, to the bones of the man who had died here. Ronald stepped back, his chest tight, as he stared at the cluster. There was no mistaking it now. This was no ordinary treasure. This was a grim reminder of what had happened here, what Dalton Mercer had been holding on to until his last breath. A treasure that had cost him everything. The storm had torn away the facade of time, revealing the painful truth hidden beneath the surface. Ronald could feel it, a deep sense of connection to the man who had died here, a soldier who had been forgotten, whose story had been erased from history. Rex sat beside him, his amber eyes scanning the wreckage. The dog didn't need to sniff the earth anymore. He didn't need to search for clues. They had found what they had come for. But that wasn't the end of the journey. Not yet. Ronald stood, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The pain in his knee was sharp now, but it didn't matter. The ache in his heart, the one that had never gone away, was far worse. The weight of the sapphires, of the bones of the legacy that had been buried here, was more than he could carry on his own. It was time to face the truth. He turned to Rex, who stood at his side, his tail wagging slowly in the snow. The dog was still as focused as ever, but there was something else in his eyes, a quiet understanding. Rex wasn't just a companion anymore. He was a partner, a fellow soldier, a witness to the past that had been uncovered. "We're not finished yet, buddy," Ronald murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to bring him home." The next step wasn't clear. They had found the sapphires, yes. They had unearthed the past. But what came next? What was the purpose of this discovery? What was the meaning behind it all? Ronald wasn't sure. But he knew this much: he couldn't walk away now. Not when it was staring him in the face. He had to finish what had been started all those years ago. He had to bring Dalton Mercer's story to light. For the man who had died here. For the soldier who had been forgotten, and in some strange way for himself. Rex let out a soft whine, nudging Ronald's hand with his nose. It was as if the dog understood that this was more than just a physical journey. It was a journey of redemption, of uncovering the truth, of coming to terms with the past. The world around them was still. The snow continued to fall, the trees swaying in the wind, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots in the snow. But Ronald didn't feel alone anymore. With Rex by his side, the weight of the past didn't seem as heavy. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Ronald felt as if he was finally headed in the right direction. As they made their way back toward the cabin, Ronald felt a flicker of hope. It was faint, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm, but it was there. The journey wasn't just about the sapphires. It wasn't just about the buried foundation. It was about bringing someone home. And in doing so, Ronald realized maybe he was bringing himself home too. The cabin was quieter now, the stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood as the wind howled outside. The storm had passed, but the oppressive silence that followed felt just as heavy. Ronald sat by the window, staring out at the valley below, his mind racing with the fragments of the past and the weight of the present. He had been back here countless times, but this time felt different. This time the mountains weren't just his home. They were a graveyard. A place where forgotten memories had been buried for decades, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up. Rex lay curled up near the stove, his body stretched out, his breathing steady, but there was an air of restlessness about him. The dog had always been his companion, his partner, but tonight there was something more in the air. It was as if the walls of the cabin weren't just holding back the winter cold, but the ghosts of a past that Ronald had long since buried. The rucksack was heavy at his feet, the rough canvas containing the evidence of their discovery, the crate, the sapphires, the bones of a soldier who had died trying to protect what he loved. But the mystery wasn't just about the gems or even the man who had died in that fire. It was about the legacy, the story that had been erased, and the truth that had been buried with him. Ronald reached down and unzipped the rucksack, pulling out the small, leather-bound notebook. He had barely touched it since they found it afraid of what he might discover. But now it felt like the right time. The small pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible. He opened it carefully, scanning the pages, his heart heavy with each word. The handwriting, frantic at times, calm at others, told the story of a man who had tried to escape the world, to escape his debts, his past, his mistakes. But it also told the story of a father, a man who had tried to provide for his son even when everything around him was falling apart. The last entry was dated August 12th, 1968, the day the fire had consumed the cabin, the day Dalton Mercer had died. Ronald read the words again, his throat tightening as he absorbed the final desperate sentences. "I cannot leave them. They are for Victor. If I lose them, I have nothing to leave him but my name. And my name is already ruined. Victor." The name echoed in Ronald's mind, and for the first time the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about a lost soldier. It was about a family, a legacy that had been erased. A son who had never known his father's love. Ronald leaned back in the chair, the weight of the notebook heavy in his lap. He had spent so many years running from his own memories, trying to bury his grief. But now, in this small cabin with Rex at his feet, it felt like he was staring directly into the eyes of a ghost, one that had been left behind in the ashes of a fire. The memories of his own family flooded back, of his wife Sarah and their daughter Emily. He had pushed them away, convinced that he was protecting them from his pain. But now, as he looked down at the dog tag in his hand, the one that had once belonged to Dalton Mercer, he realized how wrong he had been. Dalton had tried to protect his son, but in doing so, he had isolated himself from the world. He had died alone, clutching the sapphires he had worked so hard to find, a treasure that had become his obsession, his legacy. But now it wasn't just about the treasure. It was about bringing Dalton Mercer home. It was about giving him the peace he had never had. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finding that same peace for himself. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes, and Ronald stood up, the decision settling in his chest like a stone. The time for waiting was over. They had found the truth, now they had to finish what they had started. "We're going back to the town, Rex," he said quietly, the words slipping out like a promise. The dog stirred his ears, flicking at the sound of Ronald's voice. Rex raised his head and gave a low, satisfied whine, as if to say, "Finally." Ronald reached for his jacket, sliding it on over his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle on him like armor. The world outside had been quiet for too long, and it was time to face it. Time to confront the ghosts that had haunted him for years. He grabbed the rucksack and slung it over his shoulder, the weight of it grounding him, pulling him back into the present. With a glance at Rex, who was already standing by the door ready for the next step, Ronald stepped outside into the biting cold. The snow had started to fall again, the first flakes of another storm that would soon be upon them. But this time, it didn't matter. This time there was something bigger than the weather, something bigger than the cold. There was a mission to complete. The truck rattled to life as they pulled away from the cabin, the headlights cutting through the night. The road that led to the town was long and winding, a dark ribbon that disappeared into the forest. Ronald's mind raced as he drove, the weight of the discovery still settling over him. The sapphires, the bones, the man who had died trying to protect them. But more than that, it was the connection. The connection between Dalton Mercer and himself. Between the soldier who had died alone and the man who had spent years hiding from the world. Ronald glanced at Rex, whose face was lit by the dim glow of the dashboard. The dog's amber eyes were steady, unwavering, as though he understood the gravity of the situation. There was no turning back now. When they reached the town, it was late, the streets empty and quiet. It wasn't much of a place, a handful of buildings, a couple of small shops, a diner on the corner that had long since seen its heyday. But it was the only place where the past might still be remembered, where someone might still know something about Dalton Mercer. They parked outside the library, the dim light from the street lamp casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The door to the library creaked as it opened, and the warm air inside felt like a welcome relief after the cold night. Inside, the librarian, Mrs. Martha, looked up from behind the desk. She was a small woman, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, and she gave Ronald a nod of recognition. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ross?" she asked, her voice kind but distant. "I need to see the archives," Ronald said, his voice steady. "Specifically, the local newspapers from 1968. She raised an eyebrow. 1968? 968. That's a long time ago. What's the reason? Something came up, Ronald said, his voice tight. Something about a man named Dalton Mercer. The mention of the name seemed to cause a shift in Mrs. Martha's demeanor. She set her pen down, her expression unreadable. "I'll get them for you," she said, standing up slowly. As she retrieved the dusty-bound volumes, Ronald's thoughts were consumed by what they had uncovered. The story of Dalton Mercer wasn't just about a man who had died in a fire. It was about a father who had fought to protect his son, and in doing so had sealed his own fate. And now, as he stood in the quiet library, Ronald couldn't help but think about his own daughter, about Emily. He had spent so many years pushing her away, thinking he was protecting her. But Dalton Mercer had tried to protect his son too, and in the end he had failed. The thought hit him like a brick. He was running out of time. The clock in the library ticked loudly in the silence as Ronald flipped through the dusty volumes of the County Gazette. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the news from 1968 was clear. The short-clipped articles painted Dalton Mercer in a light Ronald couldn't reconcile with the man he had discovered. "Local man missing after cabin fire," one article began. Sheriff's Department reports that a fire late Tuesday night completely destroyed the cabin of Dalton Mercer, a recluse and veteran of the Second World War. No remains were found at the scene. Mercer is believed to have intentionally set the fire to escape mounting debts. Ronald read the article once, twice. His heart pounded in his chest. Intentionally set the fire. The town had cast Dalton as a coward, a man who had failed his family and fled when things got tough. But Ronald had been there with Rex in the woods, with the wreckage of a man who had fought to protect someone. That someone, Ronald realized, was his son Victor. The legacy of the sapphires, the fire, the loss, it all made sense now. Dalton Mercer had never run. He had died clinging to a promise he couldn't keep. He had kept the sapphires safe, not because of their value, but because they represented everything he had wanted to give his son. The room felt warmer now, as the truth unfolded like a long-forgotten map. He had thought he was solving a mystery, but in the end it was about much more than that. It was about redemption for Dalton and for him. "I found him," Ronald whispered softly to himself, feeling a sudden surge of emotion. "I found him." Mrs. Martha returned to the desk, glancing over at Ronald with a quiet curiosity. "Mr. Ross, anything I can help with?" he nodded, pushing the Gazette volume aside. "It's true, isn't it? What they said about Dalton Mercer." She paused, her lips tightening into a grim line. "I wouldn't say it's true. The man had his demons. But people didn't know the whole story. They didn't know about the sapphires. Or the promise he made. I don't think anyone really understood him." "Do you know where his son went?" Ronald asked, his voice urgent. He needed to know if there was any chance of finding Victor, any chance to close the chapter on this man's life. "Mrs. Martha shook her head. "The search was called off years ago. The sheriff said Mercer was just a man on the run. There was no one to claim him, no one to follow up. But I've heard rumors. Some people say his son took a different name and left town." Ronald closed the newspaper, the quiet anger in his chest bubbling to the surface. "Victor deserved better than that," he muttered. "You're right, Mrs. Martha agreed quietly. "But that's the way the world works sometimes. People get lost." The words stung like cold metal against his skin. Ronald knew what it was like to feel lost, to push people away in the name of self-preservation, and now here he was staring at the consequences of that decision. He walked out of the library with a heavy heart, his thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and resolve. As he reached the truck, Rex stood at attention by the door, sensing his handler's turmoil. The old German shepherd didn't need words to know what was happening. He simply nudged Ronald's hand with his nose, a reminder that they had a mission. And no matter how heavy the burden, they would see it through. Ronald climbed into the driver's seat, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The engine rumbled to life, and they drove back toward Blackwood Ridge, the weight of the discovery heavier now than ever before. As they approached the familiar turnoff that led up the mountain, the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. The road was barely visible in the growing darkness, the snow falling in thick sheets that blurred the line between earth and sky. But nothing would stop him now. The answers had already been found. It was time to return them to the land where they belonged. Ronald and Rex trudged up the mountain with slow, steady steps, the night air biting at their faces, cutting through the cold silence of the forest. The trees seemed to lean in on them, their gnarled branches heavy with snow like ancient sentinels watching over the land. The climb was arduous, made more difficult by the thick snow and the weight of the rucksack, but Ronald kept moving. He had to. For Dalton. For Victor. For himself. As they neared the ridge, a familiar knot of tension formed in his chest. This was where it had all started, where the foundation had been uncovered, where the past had been brought to the surface. But this time it was different. This time they weren't just searching for clues. They were bringing someone home. Rex moved ahead, his nose working through the cold air, his ears swiveling with alertness. The old dog had sensed something long before Ronald had. They weren't alone. Ronald's heartbeat quickened as he followed Rex through the snow. They reached the site where the foundation had once stood, the ruins now half buried by the shifting earth. It was here that they had found the body, the evidence of a life and death left behind. But tonight there was no digging. There was no searching. Tonight they were here for something more. Rex sat at attention, his body stiff, and still his eyes fixed on the ground beneath them. Ronald stopped beside him, looking down at the spot where Dalton Mercer had been buried, where his story had ended. Ronald closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, but underneath it all there was something else, something that felt like closure. He had come here to find answers. But in the process, he had found a deeper understanding of himself. The weight of his own guilt, his own regret, had slowly lifted over the course of this journey. It wasn't about the treasure or even the history. It was about a promise. A promise that had been broken, a legacy that had been lost, and the redemption of a man who had been forgotten. He reached into his rucksack and pulled out the bundle, the wrapped-up heart cluster of metal and gemstones. The sapphires were still glowing faintly, their deep blue light illuminating the night, casting a faint glow over the scene. The heart of Dalton Mercer still preserved in the wreckage of his life. He knelt down and gently placed the bundle in the snow. Rex moved closer, lowering his head to nudge it with his nose, as though confirming that it was exactly where it needed to be. "We're bringing you home, soldier," Ronald whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not forgotten anymore." As he stood, a strange peace settled over him. The past wasn't something to be buried, it was something to be honored. The sapphires, the fire, the tragedy, they had all come together for a reason. The legacy that Dalton Mercer had tried to leave behind wasn't just about wealth. It was about love. And in that moment, Ronald understood. The man who had died alone in the fire, clinging to his treasures, had never been truly alone. He had his legacy, his son's future, and in the end, that had been enough. But Ronald wasn't alone either. He had Rex. He had the truth, and now he had peace. They left the ridge in silence, the truck winding its way down the mountain, the storm now a distant memory. Ronald glanced at Rex, who lay peacefully in the back seat, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog had been his companion through it all, through the fire and the ashes, the anger and the regret. As they reached the town, Ronald drove straight to the cemetery where Dalton Mercer's grave now lay. The flag had been folded, the service had ended, and the town had finally given him the recognition he deserved. The grave, simple and modest, stood beneath the shade of the oak tree, a testament to the man who had never been forgotten, even if his name had been lost in the past. Rex sat up as they parked, his ears twitching. He knew this place. He had sensed the shift, the final resolution that had come with the burial. Ronald didn't say anything as he sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the grave. His fingers tightened around the dog tag in his pocket, feeling its cold surface, its weight. Dalton Mercer had kept his promise. And so would Ronald. He got out of the truck and walked slowly to the grave, Rex following at his side. They stood there for a moment, the wind brushing through the trees, the silence of the cemetery wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time in years, Ronald felt the presence of something he had long since lost hope. "I'm here, Victor," Ronald said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." And with that, the past was finally laid to rest. The morning after the funeral was as quiet as the world had been when Ronald first arrived at Blackwood Ridge. The heavy snow had begun to melt, revealing the earth beneath soft and thawing. The last vestiges of winter clung to the trees, but the air smelled of spring, fresh and clean, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Ronald sat on the porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, his gaze drifting over the valley below. The sun was up now, casting a pale golden light across the landscape, warming the earth and the snow that clung stubbornly to the mountaintops. The world was waking up, and so was he. Beside him, Rex lay in the patch of sunlight that had finally reached the yard, the German shepherd content and relaxed. His tail thumped softly against the porch with every passing breeze. The old dog had earned his rest, and for the first time in a long while, it seemed that he was truly at peace. Ronald's fingers ran absent-mindedly over the dog tag in his pocket, the small piece of metal that had once been a soldier's identity. Dalton Mercer had carried it into the flames, but in the end it was Ronald who had brought him home, and in doing so, he had brought himself back too. The letter from Vivian Bennett had arrived that morning, a gentle reminder of the connections that remained even after the dust had settled. She had told him about the endowment in Dalton's name, about the legacy that would continue to benefit others, a fitting tribute to the man who had been lost but not forgotten. The path Ronald had walked through the mountain through the memories of his own past had not been easy, but it had been necessary. He had buried his own grief, his own guilt for so long, but now in the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the sun warming his face and Rex at his side, he understood what it meant to heal, to move forward. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned from Dalton's story, from the man who had lost everything in the fire, who had been consumed by a treasure meant for someone else, yet had never abandoned the love he had for his family. It had been his obsession, yes, but it had also been his way of protecting what mattered most. In the end, his efforts to secure a future for Victor had only brought him closer to the man he'd been, but hadn't yet become a father, a protector, a soldier. Ronald had once thought that hiding from the world was the only way to protect it. But Dalton's story, his struggle, had shown him the opposite. It was through facing the past, through accepting the pain and loss, that true healing began. The things he had buried, the things he had avoided, had to be confronted, not just for the sake of the past, but for the future. The phone rang inside the cabin, interrupting the quiet reflection. Ronald stood up slowly, setting the coffee mug on the step, and walked inside. He answered it before it could ring again, his fingers brushing over the dog tag in his pocket once more. Ronald, Emily's voice came through the line, tentative, unsure, but there was a warmth in her words that hadn't been there before. "It's me." He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. "I'm here, kiddo," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm ready." And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like home. Rex padded in behind him, sensing the change in the air. His tail swished lazily as he settled at Ronald's feet, his warm body offering a comfort Ronald hadn't known he needed. "I'm ready," Ronald whispered again, a small smile pulling at his lips. "I'm ready to move forward." He looked back out at the valley, at the mountain that had once been so isolating. And now, with Rex by his side, with the past finally laid to rest, the road ahead seemed clear. The ghosts were gone. The silence had been broken. The journey wasn't over yet, but it had changed. And that, Ronald realized, was the most important part of the story.